remember, you grew up in Russia, right? And she says, yes. And he says, behind the Iron Curtain, right? And she says, yes. Remember what they did to those who talked too much in Russia. You don't want to do that to us.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time, cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David DuByne.
And I do welcome you today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this planet. If you've been following me for any amount of time, this is the most important amount of information I can ever deliver in a small amount of time. We finally have verification of the timeline going into this grand solar minimum, when the food crop losses are coming, when the global famine shall start, but nobody wants to discuss it. So today we're going to compare several information flows about the intensity of the next solar cycle on the regular 11-year solar cycle. We're going to talk about the timelines and who's predicting what, and you should have a very good indication of how this thing is going to start to unfold, and I mean starting right now. This is no longer conjecture of when it's going to happen. This grand solar minimum, the crop losses. We can insulate our homes, we can insulate our cars, we can have more salt on the roads, but this planet cannot function without enough food, period. Energy, if that's taken away from you, there's alternatives. There's no alternative for not eating. So this is the timeline going through. This is it. This is the final caveat, which you need to put everything together. And from this point forward, all the information I'm going to release is absolutely going to shift diametrically compared to with all this information I'm telling you about today. So if you've been paying attention at all, you notice that Valentina Zharkova has come out with the talk at the Global Warming Policy Forum and gave her predictions of what's going to happen. Now, she's been very tight-lipped about anything with this intensifying grand solar minimum that could affect our society. Now, also at the same time, Ben Davidson over at Suspicious Observers put out his grand solar minimum forecast, talking about the maximum sunspot numbers, the smoothed max, when the sunspots are going to diminish into nothing and when they might return. And then also John Casey with his forecast of 50 sunspots or less during this next cycle. So I'm going to weave these three elements together here, and then I'm going to go into the current crop losses, the unusual weather events. Again, they're getting 2-3 months worth of rain in 3 hours, Australia this time. So if you have a limited amount of time, I encourage you to stick around for the next 10 minutes so you can see this crystal ball for your life. And also that crystal ball involves a history book so you can truly understand the ramifications for our society based on what happened. And the Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum, the Sporer minimum, and now the verification of the Chinese back at 31 AD about the blocking of the sun for 3 hours. That's right at that cycle of 79 AD where the planetary geometry matches what we will see exactly in 2024.
And this episode's brought to you by TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds since 1974. Full range of garden seeds, microgreen seeds, sprouting seeds, wheatgrass, grain seeds, flower seeds, herb seeds, and ground cover crop. I encourage you to take a look at their website, TrueLeafMarket.com, and they even have free starter guides there for you to learn how to grow sprouts, microgreens, herbs, and wheatgrass. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
So there's a lot of things happening right now, and a lot of ancient cultures have pointed to this time of being a magnificent energy uplift, if you will, a vibrational change state of your mind, your body, the spirit, our earth, the sun, everything changes vibrationally. And what seems to we're entering in this now, the sun is the center point of all of this. All the ancient cultures worshipped our sun for some reason. Now I'm beginning to understand why. The vibration changes in our sun affect the vibration of the human spirit and thinking patterns. The sun's vibration, the energy light waves, and literally the output of particles, those have a direct effect on our earth in terms of climate, heating and cooling, how much food we have, how much food we don't have. So taking a look, we're going to bring you over here. If you're on YouTube, or I'm going to take you to a couple YouTube videos that I would like you to watch if you can. You can write these down and come back to them later. First one here is Professor Valentina Zharkova. And the title, again, is The Solar Magnetic Field and the Terrestrial Climate. Now, you can find this one over at the Global Warming Policy Forum, or GWPF. Now, Valentina has been very, 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 very tight-lipped about any of her predictions talking about global reduction in population and reduction in food output. Even up to just this talk right here, she would not talk about grand minima to a great extent. She came out and talks about global food shortages beginning for a full 4-year period from 2028 to 2032, where they're talking almost zero production coming, anything that I have been saying, the exact same places, 45 degrees north and above, where we grow grains, there's going to be almost nothing produced in these zones. Also, she predicts the next grand minima starting in 2020, that the downtrend in temperatures, we're going to be slowly trickling down in temperatures through 2019 to the point where people will notice that the global temperatures are back to the baseline or even under that, not anywhere close to going up in temperature. But 2020, we take a severe drop down in the progression steps down through the bottom at 2030. Now, I had predicting the bottom at 2024 to 2025 with a cool. Her new predictions are we're just going to be continuing down to 2030, and the population is going to decline with this decline in temperatures on our planet. The grand minima that she's talking about, 2020 to 2053. Midpoint would be 2030, that same no-grow time that she references. There's a couple of very interesting things that happened in her paper and her talk. First, when you watch the video, if you go to the Global Warming Policy Forum's upload, you'll see the introduction where this gentleman, I don't know who it is, he introduces Valentina, but then he says to her, remember, you grew up in Russia, right? And she says, yes. And he says, behind the Iron Curtain, right? And she says, yes. The forum says to her, remember what they did to those who talked too much in Russia. You don't want to do that to us. And then he tries to make a joke out of it, and then you could see her flinch a little bit and become a little bit nervous. That was a warning not to unload the full scale of what she was going to say. She must have told somebody prior to what was going to be said in this about food crop losses, because she touched on it a few times. And what is so surprising to me, they're sitting there with a room full of solar physicists and others, Tall Bloke, Piers Corbin, and a gamut of others. But only somebody at the end made a joke about the food crop losses. When they referenced, they said, well, you're talking about putting together a Manhattan-style project to do indoor vertical agriculture and shift all the grow zones so we have enough food on the planet. And she says, yes. And then the gentleman in the audience, I couldn't see who it was behind the camera there, behind some heads, says, well, they tried that with the IPCC and it didn't work. Now, why do you think trying to get a global initiative to shift our grow zones to get enough food to feed everybody is going to work? That was the only thing said about the crop losses. Like if I had been in that particular venue, I would have specifically asked, is this going to be like a linear event where we're going to get a tenth of a degree cooler every single year until 2025, and what's the drop off going to be? And this food loss that you're talking about, global famine at 2028. It's not going to be like 2027 on December 31st, then boom, the famine starts. No, it's going to be continuously cutting into the food supply as we move forward. So I would have been asking, okay, well, when do you think the first major food losses are going to come? And will they be noticeable? And do you have a percentage decline rate that you anticipate moving forward with every single year? Because if we're talking about nearly 0% coming out of anything 40 north, that's all, or 45 north, that's where we grow the grains, the rye, the wheat, the buckwheat, etc., canola. It's not going to all happen the first year. So there has to be some calculation going out what the losses are going to be. Now, also what was very interesting in this talk is when she started talking about the 2,100-year cycle, her slides went blank to the point where they framed her and they put a blurred background across everything she was showing. And even later on in the Q&A, they still don't reference and go back to that slide. And all the slides in the Q&A, they're overexposed and they're in the background. So we never saw those slides that she was talking about these repeating cycles. And then she also touched on major full-blown glaciation. And she also talked about super cycles of all of this, encapsulating within. She's talking about predictions of a 3,000 to a 10,000 year backward fit on the grand minima, warming periods and cooling periods. Now, she broke this down into 2,100 year periodicity. But then Tall Bloke says, yeah, our information and our oversets with the de Vries cycle and a few others lead up to 208 year cyclicity as well. Now, if you just multiply 10 of those 208 year, you come up with 2,080 years, which is very close to that 2,100 years. Now, plus or minus 20 years on a 2,000-year event, that's a rounding error. So they're both in this exact same ballpark. Now, John Casey calls 207-year cycles, and they're all right in the ballpark. So was she telling us we're going back to a 2,100-year cooling event? Or is she saying we're going back to something like a 6,000-year cooling event? Either way, the information she provided was downright stark and scary. And I couldn't believe that the people in the audience didn't ask smarter questions about the food crop losses. That's the most important thing on our planet. No food, no society. Now, bringing you over here to Ben Davidson over at Suspicious Observers, he released an amazing video as well. So well done. Ben, thanks for putting the information out. He runs through what is being noticed in the sun in terms of declines and how many flares there should have been in the intensity of the sun. And it's literally 10 times less than it should be. In terms of flares coming out, the activity that we should have seen, the magnetic effects, the solar winds, all these things on the averages that should be expected during an 11-year solar cycle just weren't there this solar cycle. Now, the conclusions that Ben and Lisa Upton reached were maximum sunspot numbers of 100 sunspots for the next solar cycle. Smooth at 75. This is a complete doubling of what John Casey's numbers are. John says 50 or less, 50 sunspots or less during the next cycle. Now, Valentina Zharkova's work also puts it at way less than 75, down there in the 50-ish range. And then in the next solar cycle 26, less than 25 or even lower. The sunspots, this is Ben's forecast here, the sunspots are going to return around 2020 to 2021. Now, during that time, this matches up with Valentina Zharkova saying we're going to get colder through 2020. Now, the sunspot return, when it does come, is going to be a fraction of a minimum of what we just saw during this last solar cycle. Now, Ben's numbers are double what the other two forecasters, Valentina Zharkova and John Casey, have put out. So it's great to see this full range of what people are predicting and what they think and the timelines going forward. But they all end up in one single end point at the singularity of all their predictions. We're not going to have enough food on this planet, period. Doesn't matter if the sunspot max in this low cycle is going to be at 2026 for the next solar cycle, and then we drop off into nothingness through 2030 and we go to the global famine, which they're both talking about here. Yet nobody's really talking about their forecast combined as a timeline moving out, and It all points to the exact same society reset. Then we got The Economist magazine with their total black cover this year. I'm saying and equating that was the black horse of the famine of the apocalypse coming as a reference of what it could be, not a blackout in terms of electricity, but they're forecasting higher food pricing and less food. Now, not all swiftly happening in a single year. And that's what I wanted, with Valentina's work, is what are the predictions if we're going to nothing? It has to be a percentage loss per year. Now, is The Economist pure black cover? Are they also alluding to the exact same thing? That the food from this point forward, we're going into a famine. We're going into a global decline in food production. There's just not going to be enough food for people. There's going to be an absolute reduction in population on this planet. And I hope you're not one of them. If you are listening and you do any types of preparation, you should be able to grow some of your own food, have some stockpiles, and get ready for this. But most people aren't. So where's this going to leave you in the future? Well, it's going to leave you in probably several scenarios that none of them are going to be happy unless you're working with a community around you. First off, you're not going to want your starving neighbors with their starving kids knocking at your door knowing that you have food and they're starving. And then you got to, what's your choice? And if you refuse them food, they're going to come back with some kind of whatever they can to get in your house and get your food, because hungry people do strange things. Now, this is a couple think tank reports coming out of Washington as well. One of the spook factors for them, the scary unknowables, if you will, was when these famines hit, or when they're trying to talk about the bottom 10% of the population that's on food assistance that won't be able to afford the just basic necessities unless the government raises their subsidy per month on the cards to be able to purchase food. Even if it's 5% that can't afford it, they're going to cause a civil disturbance. Now, the hungry people are the unknowns because they have a full set of scenarios on the push and pull, and they know the stimulus, and they know your outcome, and they know how you're going to react on almost 99.999% of all stuff that you can possibly do or think. They've been studying this for 100 years. Also, they've been studying for 100 years what happens in famines and what people do. They are wild animals that are uncontrollable. You don't know what their next moves are going to be because they're so... Your body and mind takes over to survival mode at that point. You're going to starve to death, or you are going to find food and do whatever it takes to get that food, including cannibalism. You're going to have to draw a line here too. Like you're going to see people eating people on the streets or whatever happens. That is some incredible mind. This is going to reset. And so think about the society moving forward, like how people are going to think. We kind of grew up in a certain way, thinking certain things were possible or not possible, but all this information that now points to these exact dates, like you can see the civil upheaval already happening. Like in Egypt, they're trying to, but the warehouses where they're stocking potatoes, because the potato wholesalers were keeping some of their own stock because they knew prices were going to rise next week. And then the supply demand, what ended up happening was the bottom 20% got completely priced out of the market. And then they started the civil unrest again. Police out on the streets, army out on the streets. They needed a scapegoat, so they blamed the warehouse people that are controlling the potato supply chain. So the army went in and gave them three choices. First choice, we're going to give you this price from last week, and you're going to take it, and you're going to release the potatoes. Second choice, if you don't do that, we're going to put you in jail. Third choice, we're going to put you in jail, and if you resist, we're going to shoot you on the spot. This is happening in Egypt and in the Philippines. Duarte was doing the same thing with rice pricing. Rice traders were holding back. They had huge losses this year. He says, front page news, I'm going to come and raid your warehouses, and if you resist, you'll be shot. You're going to take the prices we give you. That's it. End of story.
And since I have been talking about our need moving forward in this new society that we're entering as our global grain production starts to be reduced in yield, your food prices are going to skyrocket. And I mean skyrocket, not just doubling or tripling, something like 5 or 10 times higher by 2020 at the very least. TrueLeafMarket.com. I really want to talk about growing your own food, which will be a necessity moving forward. They've been around since 1974, heirloom and organic seeds. Since I've started talking about them in my videos, I have a lot of people write and say that they've previously ordered, that they know the owner, having great results, good customer service. They quite enjoyed the seed quality as well. There's so many ways that we can go about growing different types of vegetables that we're going to need. Microgreens are incredibly nutritious. They're super fast to grow. In less than a week, you can have something that you can eat. And we know the benefits of microgreens. All you have to do is use a search engine and look up vitamin, mineral, nutrient content of microgreens. You'll be shocked. Also, sprouts. We can get those a little bit taller, a little more dense, a little bit larger volume on the vegetation mass coming off of there. So how do you know what kind of sprouts to grow? How about wheatgrass or herbs? What about different types of herbs that we can add to our foods? Now, what I just described to you, there's a full range of starter guides there at TrueLeafMarket.com for you to take a look at. Even if it's just for your own knowledge and you don't purchase something from them, at least get the information so you know how to grow microgreens, you know how to grow sprouts, you understand what some of the herbs are for. And not only that, they have wheatgrass and grain seeds. So when I'm talking about grain growing regions going offline, we just need to look back in history and see where across the planet there was difficulty growing grains when this grand solar minimum intensified and the jet stream started wandering just like they're doing today, due to a decreased magnetosphere that does not hold our jet streams locked in their traditional flows. Grains are one thing, herb seeds are another, cover crops, something different, but whatever you do, organic seeds are going to be a necessity because you can save those seeds and then grow them the next season, which you unequivocally cannot do with GMO. TrueLeafMarket.com. Use the link below and give yourself the gift of organic and heirloom seeds.
So if it's happening already, and we have these instances of these less developed economies where they're already using police and army to go in to find and get to the food storage areas because there's already social upheaval due to just rising prices, you got to realize this is a completely different thing than non-availability. Non-availability means I don't care if you have the money, you're not going to get it. Trying to figure out what's going on, talk to a couple futures traders, and they're like, yeah, man, the smart thing for you to do is get the contracts and take the physical delivery. They're like, the paper world we're moving out of, and we're moving into the physical world where they're saying the drawdown on the physical deliveries is not going to be enough to meet the demand that's on the paper. And this will be for wheat, hard red winter wheat moving out, and rye moving out, oats moving in the future. Like the actual physical delivery of those onto a rail car, that's the future play for the futures market, literally. And we see the same thing happening with gold. There's not enough to cover over in the LME up to the London Metals Exchange. Their drawdowns were something like 30 tons. People were asking for 30 tons physical delivery, and they only had like 18 tons in the warehouse. So they were telling people, 30 to 60 days, whatever, we'll get you your gold, but you got to hold on. Now, what happens again on this delivery coming up in the next contract? What happens when people pull again, and what are they going to do? Like the system's starting to come unraveled with this paper plays out here for the physical versus what people want in their hands compared to what's in the paper in the stock market or on the derivatives market or in the ETF or whatever the hell it is. So as I've been saying also, the market will be the plug will be pulled out of the stock market and the plug will be pulled out of the economy to stop you from moving around the planet. Now, with these solid numbers going forward of when we know the food shortages and famines and social unrest and everything will happen before 2028, because you're not going to have a full-on no-grow time with global famine and just it's going to happen. All these repercussions are all going to happen before that. And it's just trying to pin the years of when the consciousness of our planet, the global populace, wakes up to the fact that we're going exactly where I'm telling you we're going. When people, like the average person, wakes up and they understand this information, this is going to shift the paradigm. Now, it could shift in two directions. It could shift where literally, this is what all the ancient culture is talking about. The collective consciousness of all humans on the planet thinking of a certain thing at a certain time could actually shift reality, like the physical makeup of matter around the planet. Now, the media is doing a very good job to keep everybody divided and spread hate, and they don't want you all thinking the same message. Remember, some of you older people out there, Y2K, 1999, December 31st. Going to bring you back then. Now, remember, that could have been one of the biggest, most joyous, amazing connections of the human spirit ever, that millennial turn to the year 2000. But they did their very best to fill it with terrorism threats, Y2K threats, and take all that joy that could have been celebrated and connected out of that equation. So every time the human psyche and the global populace starts to think a certain way and they start to bond together, there's always a hand above that to put a wedge in there and distract and divide again. But this moving forward is not going to be a hideable event in the media. This is going to be full on. Every country will know what's happening. Now, what's the other outcome? We could vibrate out. We could perhaps turn our bodies to where we don't need as much food. I don't know. The vibrational frequency that we could change with the sun changing, and if our minds change, and we can perhaps build a different world with our minds, literally jump dimensionality with the collective consciousness of 8 billion people thinking about love and survival together, along with the amplification of the sun, the vibration frequency from the sun also. Like, we could put all that together as a package and jump reality and get out of this. We would survive through this cleanly. There'd be a bunch of new invention, and it would come out in a completely different paradigm and a completely different mind frame of how we operate as the human species on this planet. The other possibility is, well, what we've been fed and what we've seen for the last 70 years, that ain't working still to this day. It's getting worse. This whole low vibration, iron vibration, the Kali Yuga. If we get more of this amplified by 8 billion people, this is not a reality that we want to be in. So coming up to it, you really have a choice. We're talking about literally taking your mind and using it in a way to manifest something positive that helps everybody, that helps everything evolve upward. Because there's only two roads we're going to go down with this. It's not going to be like a hybrid of half the people thinking that, and the other half. It's going to be all or nothing. Because we're all in this together. The entire planet is in it together. So what would you think the timeline would be? All the forecasters are saying cold, 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 and at least until 2020. Ben's saying that the sunspots will return in 2020 to 2021, which should rewarm a little bit. But the rest of the solar forecasters are just saying we're going straight down into this grand solar minimum and we ain't coming back. And if we do, it'll be a slight bump along the road into 2030. So you got to think about these next few years of the cooling. Is it going to be a linear trend? Now, also one other thing. I watched Valentina's talk twice, actually. I know some of you might think that's very science nerdy, but it was a lot to encapsulate in a single talk. And there were a couple of tidbits that I found or, came to my attention after watching it the second time. What she was talking about is also mixes in with Milankovitch cycles. But the way the sun is currently in relation to our orbit, the northern hemisphere summers are going to get hotter for a shorter period of time. For like 2 months during the summer, the northern hemisphere temperatures are going to skyrocket. And then everybody will say, global warming, yeah. But on the converse, northern hemispheric winters are going to get incredibly cold, brutally cold, like unbelievable 400, 1,000, 2,000 year cold events, like the whole winter, which is going to extend out into the growing seasons. And then she talked about the same thing I am referencing, vibrational frequency from the sun. And what she talks about is the plants are picking up on the difference in the electromagnetic frequency coming out of our sun. The plants and the trees and the vegetables are picking up what's going on at the moment. So I'll read you a quote. I even wrote it down. I thought it was so important that I'm working on a video to try to tie all this together. And it was a study from Greece that was over the last 2 years, because they noticed in Greece and Italy and Slovenia, and you'll notice Croatia now, these countries have been hit with all-time record everything in the last 2 years in a row. I don't care what event weather-wise it is, it's been an all-time record. So they started studying in Greece, and they really began to notice that vegetation in the spring is beginning a month later. The vegetables and trees are feeling the reduction in the magnetic field, and they're going into conservation mode, which means that the yields on our crops are going to be less anyway. So even if we grow the exact same acreage globally, the yield from these plants is going to be down, just because magnetically they're feeling the magnetic field changes, the UV changes, and they're going into conservation mode. That'll be a 20% reduction alone just on this fact. Now, nature's responding to what the sun's doing first before we are. And also referenced, it's about the shift in the new, what we consider the new grow that you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to start your gardens after Easter, because everything prior is going to be too wet and too cold. This is going to delay the planting for everything on a planet. Now, the Northern Hemisphere is one consideration. Southern Hemisphere, we'll talk about that in a second. It's going to be too wet, too cold to plant in the traditional times. They're going to have to wait an additional month. So what's that going to do for our global agriculture? If the yield's down just on the plants with the same amount of acreage, now let's take acreage off of that, and then we take down the yield as well out of the plants. So this is what surprised me, that more people aren't talking about this. Or if they are, they're talking about it behind closed doors and trying to avoid a global panic, one of the two. Now, the Southern Hemisphere is going to behave a little bit differently. The Southern Hemisphere winters are going to be warmer, and the Southern Hemisphere summers are going to be cooler.
This video is brought to you by our friends at TrueLeafMarket.com. Heirloom and organic seeds for any grow zone on our planet.